Now that we have concluded our discussion of pedagogy of the oppressed from chapter 1 all the way to the end of chapter 4, here is a compilation of my summaries of all the chapters. I've decided that instead of just recording a summary of the whole book, it would be better to offer in one session my recorded summaries of each chapter, and I hope that would give you a brief overview of the book chapter by chapter. If you look at the very beginning of the chapter, he explains the world in this dichotomous relationship, in this agonistic relationship. There is a group of oppressors and there is a group of oppressed. That relationship, according to him, is a relationship of dominance, right? In which the oppressor group tempts and tries to create the oppressed as these silent, dehumanized subjects or objects, you could say. So the struggle then is for the oppressed to reclaim their full humanity, right? That is the object of any pedagogy, but especially of pedagogy of the oppressed. How to claim their full humanity, right, for the oppressed. Now, please keep in mind that Freire's idea of human subjectivity is pretty romantic. There is a certain romantic humanism involved over here, which was part of early Marx as well. And that he's very Marxist in his approach, or socialistic, you could say that. Now, after establishing that the world exists in this dichotomous order in which the oppressed are caught in this duality where their actions and even their consciousness is governed by the system created by the oppressors, the purpose of pedagogy of the oppressed then is to develop a kind of pedagogy with the oppressed that enables them to claim their full humanity. But since they have been dehumanized by a dehumanizing system perpetuated by the oppressors, one other aspect of liberation then is for the oppressed to not just liberate themselves, but also in the process humanize their oppressors, who, after all, by dehumanizing others, have also dehumanized themselves. So that's the project. Then in the chapter, he also discusses, how do the oppressed internalize the logic of oppression. Since they only have existed in an oppressive environment, that's the only system that they know. So even when they think of their own liberation, their first model is to emulate their masters, right? So the pedagogy of the oppressed then must also take into account that the oppressed, in defining their own humanity, realize that they can't define it on the model of their oppressors, right? They can't, when they are successful, become the oppressors themselves, right? And that's another aspect of pedagogy of the oppressed that Freire is trying to highlight. Then he goes on to describe that, okay, when the fight for liberation of the oppressed is launched by the oppressed themselves, right? How do they get there? Through praxis, right? What is praxis? Praxis is a combination of reflection and action. Reflection not just on their own selves, but also on the world in which they live, right? And when they reflect upon it and then act to change it, that is what becomes a praxis. Now, when that happens, when that liberatory movement is launched by the oppressed, he also then theorizes what to do with people who might leave the order of the oppressed and join the ranks of order of the oppressors and join the ranks of the oppressed, right? And so the idea is that they should be welcomed in solidarity, but those who have left the house of the oppressor to join the oppressed must keep in mind that they cannot come in with their own consciousness, which is formulated in the model of the oppressor, and try to tell the oppressed, this is how we do things. So there is no top-down. But there is room in a liberatory movement led by the oppressed to accept people in solidarity, people who previously might have been part of the oppressive order themselves. Then in this chapter, he also discusses the nature of oppressed consciousness. Because it's constructed by an oppressive structure and by the oppressors, sometimes, and he is coming through Fanon, the oppressed turn on each other, right? Because their situation is precarious and because they don't know anything outside of the system in which they exist, and since the public sphere is owned by the colonizers and the oppressors, right, the only violence that they can practice turns on their own communities where they fight each other. They practice it on their families, their children, right? Realizing that then enables them that part of what they are doing is caused by the trauma of living in a colonial situation, living in an oppressive environment. Then towards the middle of the chapter, he further theorizes revolutionary movement itself. How will it come about, right? How would the peasants and workers come to consciousness of their own lived condition? One thing that any liberatory movement, according to Freire, must avoid is the hijacking of the people's movement, people's liberation struggle by an elite through propaganda, right? Through sloganeering, through communiques, instructions. Because then what is happening is people are still objectified. They are tools in the hands of a demagogue or a group of people who claim to liberate them, but they're only using people as chess pieces to play their own games, right? So a true liberatory movement will make sure that no one appropriates people still as objects to achieve their own ends. Any leader who does that, according to Freire, is not doing authentic praxis. And then towards the end of the chapter, he basically teaches us that all liberatory movements, revolutions, right, they are pedagogical in nature. Pedagogical in nature because in the process of liberating ourselves, we must first learn our lived conditions, right? Those must be taught, but not taught from top. If I am a teacher and I want to teach liberatory way of life towards freedom and full humanity, I cannot bring it in a basket to my classroom and distribute it. Liberation and freedom is never given, right? So how must we go about it? We must go about it by thinking together, right? And any recipe for change that is done for the poor, for the oppressed, is not going to change that. In order for change to happen, it must be done with the oppressed. In this chapter also there is a very important concept, 2 or 3 very important concepts, but first is of false generosity that he talks about. What is false generosity? False charity or false generosity, according to Freire, is any attempts by the elite or by a group that has resources to just throw money at things or try to cosmetically change things, right? We're going to give you our extra clothes, we're going to give you some charity, without changing the structures that produce poverty, that produce inequality. That, according to Freire, is false generosity, right? And we can see that in the world aid programs, by the developed countries to developing countries, and they feel good about it, but they are not doing anything to change the global inequalities that they themselves have produced. So that is false generosity. Ngugi Thiong'o has a beautiful passage in The Devil on the Cross where he talks about that kind of false generosity, where these people bring charity to us during the day and rob us at night. That's what he says. So that's another concept that he's theorizing in this chapter. But over and all, what he is laying grounds for in this chapter is the need for pedagogy of the oppressed, but emphasizing that it cannot be top-down, that the oppressed are capable of thought and thinking and reasoning, and they know their conditions and can learn more, right? And if we or anyone else wants to work with them, we must work with their experience, right? We must think with them. And that's why towards the end he talks about intention and intentionality of consciousness, because it always tends outwards, right? That teacher and student must do that together, right? So overall, the other concept, major concept that he touches upon is conscientiousako, right? I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, which is coming to consciousness, but the kind of thinking which doesn't only think the self, but also thinks the world, the politics, the economics of one's existence. And that is what the oppressed must come to, must think the way their life and living in it in order to change the world. And so towards the end of the chapter, then he is going towards revolutionary change, right? Change in societies and elsewhere. And what he calls it, that revolutionary act itself is a pedagogical practice. It is a pedagogical practice because people must co-learn with others their own lived experiences, right? And after they have done that, they must work together to change it. The whole project, romantic as it sounds, is for the oppressed who have been dehumanized through an oppressive system by the figure of the oppressor to claim their full humanity, to be free, independent human beings in the world. Now, another thing that he points out is that this cannot just be done. We can't promise the people that after the revolution is done, they will gain all their rights and they will be able to become fully realized humans. No. People must first claim their humanity and then bring about change. There's also a cautionary note towards the end of the chapter about appropriation of the potential of the people by demagogues, by groups and constituencies who appropriate for populist reasons the sentiment of the people and their poverty and mobilize them to their own ends without changing anything. And that kind of leadership for Freire is also unauthentic, right? And the oppressed also must learn to deal with it. But also anyone who wants to take a position of leadership in any liberatory movement needs to keep that in mind, right? And so then towards the end of the chapter, what we are learning is that revolutionary change is a pedagogical practice. It involves a praxis. A praxis is always a combination of reflection and action, but reflection not just about one's own self, but one's existence in the world outside as it impacts my life and everyone else's life. And when these come together, and when teacher and student co-intend and co-think the change, then develops a kind of pedagogy, which is pedagogy of the oppressed and not for the oppressed, not top-down, but practiced and delivered, right, with the participation and full humanity of the oppressed themselves. So these are some of the thoughts, of course, that are covered in Chapter 1. That was a summary of Chapter 1. Now let's move on to Chapter 2. Today I will be briefly discussing Chapter 2 of Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And my aim here is to give you a brief summary of the main points that Freire discusses in this chapter. Now, if you have looked at the chapter starts with a very instructive sentence, and that is, a careful analysis of teacher-student relationship at any level, inside or outside the school, reveals its fundamentally narrative character. Okay, and then he goes on to suggest that education is suffering from a narrative sickness. So if you read the chapter carefully, you will obviously clearly understand that what he means by this narrative character of education is, if you keep in mind the structure of a narrative or storytelling, and that is that one person who has the role of telling a story tells the story and everyone passively listens to it. And that is how he is characterizing the existing formal and informal educational system, in which the teacher speaks and the student listens. the teacher instructs and the student is instructed, right? And so in this sense, what he's trying to suggest is that the educational system in vogue, which he calls the banking system of education, presupposes that teacher is the holder of knowledge, teacher is the agent in the classroom, and the students are passive recipients of that knowledge, right? And then on page 73 in my book, he gives you certain main characteristics of the banking system of education. Now, I do have a separate video on the banking system of education which you can watch. So I'm not going to delve deeper into it, but the basic assumption behind the banking system of education is that it's a top-down educational model in which the students do not have an active role and they are just treated as the passive recipients of knowledge. And the analogy is that of making a deposit, and that is you go into the bank, right, and you take your money and you give it to the cashier who takes it away from you and deposits it for you. And so that's the role of the teacher who has the knowledge, passes it on to students, deposits it in them. And he says that within that paradigm then, at the best, the students can become clerks and cashiers, but they can never become self-thinking individuals. Now, this is deeply connected to the entire philosophy of the book. Remember, what Freire starts with is that the world has an agonistic order, a dichotomy, and the dichotomy is between the oppressors and the oppressed. And that the natural vocation of every human being is to seek their full humanity, right? And the purpose of education is to create a system of education in which people are equipped to seek their full humanity. And for that oppressive order needs to be changed. The oppressor-oppressed dichotomy needs to be demolished. Similarly, here what he's suggesting is that the teacher-student dichotomy, in which the teacher is in the dominant position, needs to be demolished and replaced with what sometimes he calls the libertarian model of education, but as he theorizes it further, he calls it the problem-posing education, right? And that is the second concept this is introduced in this chapter. But this chapter primarily mostly explains the banking system and its ramifications. As we move into chapter 3, that's where he will start explaining the problem-posing educational model. Now, there are certain other things that he discusses which are associated with the banking system of education in this chapter. And one of those things is that the oppressed, they are not considered beings in themselves, autonomous beings in this model, since they are just considered, passive. So the teacher doesn't even acknowledge that maybe the teacher might learn something from the students. And similarly, in an oppressor-oppressed system, then the banking system not only keeps the students perpetually as objects, but also keeps them entrenched in the dichotomous system of oppressor and oppressed that exists. Because if the students are not thinking for themselves, if they are not contributing to how they ought to be educated, then what you are perpetuating then is, right, the very system of oppression which is dichotomous. And that's what he's talking about. Now, one ramification of this system of education is if people or students don't learn to think critically of the world in which they live, and the texts have to be connected to that word, then they fall prey to false prophets, right? What's the greatest example of it? Anyone who can come up with certain populist slogans can incorporate them in their project, because instead of thinking for themselves and changing the world collectively, they put their trust in these demagogues, in these leaders who appropriate the voice of the people and promise that they will change the world after they have the power. And that means that an uncritical banking system of education then can unleash a public, create a public in which fascism becomes possible. And if you have any doubts about that, don't even look at elsewhere in the world. Just look at the United States and what the populist politics have done. when a certain number of people starts believing in this messianic figure who's going to change their lives and give their votes to them, you get someone who absolutely doesn't care about the people, but who will pit you against each other, right? That is the danger of an educational system that produces uncritical human subjects, right? Now, he talks about problem-posing education, right? And basically, what he says is that it rejects this idea that education has to be top-down, that it has to be mandated from the top. And I will quote from page 80, he says, "The teacher is no longer merely the one who teaches, but one who is himself taught in dialogue with the students, who in turn, while being taught, also teach." So teaching then becomes an act of communication between the students and teachers. The students participate not only as active participants, but the teacher also then creates the kind of curriculum which has content in it, but with that content is infused with the input from the students, but also a content that relates to the world in which students live, right? And so that way, students' engagement in their own learning is increased, right? And then on 81, he says, page 81, he says, the role of the problem-posing educator is to create, together with the students, the conditions under which knowledge at the level of the doxa is superseded by the true knowledge at the level of the logos. So doxa, what is doxa? I mean, anything that is considered immutable, passed down. Logos is when you think, right? Word itself. So the purpose then in problem-posing education is to change what is considered immutable and only within the grasp of the teacher to something that can be consciously gathered, understood, consumed, and then practiced, right? Then some of the main concepts that he talks about are on page 84, right, where he concludes what he thinks the banking system is. And he says, in sum, banking theory and practice as immobilizing and fixing forces fail to acknowledge men and women as historical beings. Problem-posing theory and practice take the people's historicity as their starting point. Let's unpack this. So if you don't take your students as historical beings, then they are the same, right? And you can keep passing down the same information to them and keep pushing it down. But if you make their historicity as a starting point, that means you are living in a certain moment in time, right? And then that historicity also then enables you to see your students within the context of the world in which they live, right? Their own contribution in their own education becomes prominent. And then since they are active agents in their own education, you can go on to change the world, right, as it exists, because you've acknowledged that the students are not passive recipients of your knowledge. And this whole thing is discussed on page 84. And there's another interesting sentence there. The banking method emphasizes permanence and becomes reactionary. Problem-posing education, which accepts neither a well-behaved present nor a predetermined future, roots itself in the dynamic present and becomes revolutionary. So you already know what a reactionary order is. A reactionary order is which is trying to forestall change. And the only way you can do that is by continuously producing uncritical human subjects. A revolutionary act, as he would define later in the book, but it is when people are conscious of their lived conditions, they can think of it critically, and they believe that any knowledge that is passed on to them is not immutable, is not doxological, can be changed. And then if they reflect on it and develop a praxis around it, that's when educational act itself becomes revolutionary, because it is making sure that students in the process of learning the text or learning the materials are also learning about their life in the world, its injustices, inequalities, but then they're also developing a praxis along with the teacher to change the world, right? And that is what he calls the problem posing education. So overall, we get Freire's discussion of the banking system of education, is its connection to the oppressive order in which there are oppressors and oppressed, its mode as an ideal mode to perpetuate the status quo, right? And its purpose to create non-autonomous, non-thinking human subjects who remain passive and unaware of their place in the world, right? And they have no say in their own education. Whereas the problem-posing education that he is introducing here and upon which he concludes the chapter is the kind of education in which students have a say in their own learning. The teacher is dialogic and learns from the student about the material but also about how to teach it. Teaching is conducted in a way where the material that is being taught or discussed is not offered as immutable, where more emphasis is on students coming up with their own questions, challenging the doxa, and re-articulating whatever is being taught, and then connecting it to the words so that they can develop a praxis based in reflection and practice, right? And that's where he's headed in chapter 3. Now, I will conclude this on the last paragraph, which I'm going to read and then talk about it briefly. Problem-posing education does not and cannot serve the interests of the oppressor. No oppressive order could permit the oppressed to begin to question. Why? While only a revolutionary society can carry out this education in systematic terms, the revolutionary leaders need not take full power before they can employ the method. In the revolutionary process, the leaders cannot utilize the banking method as an interim measure, justified on grounds of expediency with the intention of later behaving in a genuinely revolutionary fashion. They must be revolutionary, that is to say, dialogic from the outset, and that is an insight of extreme brilliance. Okay, and what does it say is that you cannot bring about revolutionary change with the modes of old order. You cannot say that we've got this system of education, let's work with it, let's bring about the change, and then we will introduce the problem-posing educational system. Because then you've brought a revolution which will keep intact the power structures that were created by the banking system, right? So what he's saying is that within the process of revolutionary change, the revolution must itself be informed by the problem-posing education, because only then you will create the human subjectivities who are not products of an oppressive system, but are products of a system of education in which they become thinking, conscious, practicing human subjects. What is at stake here? At stake then, what Freire is constantly trying to teach it is that how do we transform the world in a way that the transformation and those who bring about the revolution themselves do not become the oppressors, which is the biggest problem in Marxism, right? And the only way to do it is to literally create different kinds of human beings who are seeking their full humanity, and as we learned through the readings of chapter 1, who are not just liberating themselves, but also liberating their oppressors, because the oppressors themselves are dehumanized because of their dehumanizing acts, right? And the only way to do that is not by using the tools of the banking system of education, but by developing the problem-posing education during the early phases of revolution, so that the very revolutionaries who bring about the change are a product of the problem-posing educational system. That was chapter 2. I hope it was useful to you. Now let's move on to chapter 3. Chapter 3, in my opinion, is probably the most important, because it's in chapter 3 that Freire finally gives us a method of creating, designing, and almost perfecting a dialogical problem-posing mode of education. And I think that's why this chapter is highly significant in our understanding of Freire's work. So here we go. I'll go chronologically and give you my ideas of what is covered in this chapter. The chapter starts with a discussion of dialogue, right? He is trying to explain to us that the most productive aspect of human communication is dialogic. A dialogue presupposes that two parties, two constituencies, talk to each other as equals, right? And then he gives us several attributes of what a dialogue ought to have in order for it to be a true dialogue. So first of all, it must have love of the world and of humanity, because unless you love humanity and love the world, you would not like to work for humanity, nor would you like to transform the world. So a dialogue is not a confrontational exchange. It must be guided by love. The second attribute is that it must come from a place of humility. If you are being dialogic, or if you're dialoguing with another, it won't be a dialogue if you say my opinions are more important than yours. No, you must enter it with a certain degree of humility, where you bring your own knowledge, but you also acknowledge that others have something to share and teach you. So love and humility. The third and important aspect of a dialogic situation is faith. Not the traditional faith, but faith in humanity. Faith in this idea that human beings are naturally good, but that they can transform their own lived conditions if we all work together. So faith in that possibility of humanity is the third. So we have love, humility, and faith. And then the fourth one is trust. That if two parties are dialoguing, they must trust each other. Whatever I offer must be trustworthy. It must be provably trustworthy. Because if there is no trust between two parties who are in a dialogue, then it cannot be a genuine, authentic dialogue. So love, humility, faith in people, and trust between various parties. And then hope. We cannot dialogue out of despair. We cannot dialogue about pessimistic view of the world. A dialogue must have hope of change, hope of transformation. Only then will two parties come together and have a conversation about transformation. And then finally, a dialogue must involve critical thinking. It cannot be sermonizing. It cannot be propaganda. It must encourage the participants to think critically about what they are proposing, about their own lived conditions in the world, and about what they are trying to encounter in the world. So critical thinking is a huge part of it. So dialogue must have love, humility, faith in people, trust between various parties, hope, and critical thinking. So just think of it. If we apply these principles of being a dialogical pedagogue or teachers in a classroom and take these attributes with us, that we love our students, we enter a classroom with a certain degree of humility where we are not the carriers of all the knowledge. We have faith in our students' abilities and in their aspirations to learn. And we trust our students and they trust us, right? And then we have a hopeful pedagogy, a pedagogy that gives them individual hope, collective hope, but is hopeful of the world, and then encourages critical thinking, right? In even our classrooms, we would have created a transformative classroom experience. So after he has discussed dialogue, what he's trying to encourage us is to develop a dialogical mode of education. Then he says, okay, if you want to deliver education or bring education to a certain part, you choose the part where you want to go. But then you want to study the logic within which those people are existing. That is what he calls a thematic universe. What are the larger themes that they have internalized? How do they work? How are they implemented? So even before you go into a territory and start developing a curriculum, you have to study it to know what themes exist, what is the thematic universe, what do the people believe in, how have they internalized it. And it's only after you have figured out the thematic universe of a given situation, right? And then its generative themes. Remember, he has taught us that themes are generative. They produce other themes, right? So for example, if the generative theme of any given place that you go into is a hierarchical, where people have internalized that certain people are superior and they are inferior, right? That is the larger theme of a dichotomous, naturalized social system. Within that, then that theme would generate other themes. How to behave? Do we ask permission? What are the marriage rituals? Who upholds the law? All of these are associated with that larger thematic universe in which certain people are supposed to have more value than others, right? So themes are generative, right? Then he teaches us that in any given theme or a place where people live, they encounter limit situations. Limit situations are that foreclose the possibilities of change and transformation. Most people would think that limit situations are a challenge and hinder progress. But what Freire is teaching us is that limit situations also open up to possibilities. Because when we acknowledge what the limit situations are in any given thematic universe, then we can try to figure out how to go beyond them, right? And that is where his term untested feasibility comes in. Now, untested feasibility is something that is beyond the limit situations, which can be imagined, but no one has lived it, no one has practiced it. So if we study a thematic universe, within that the limit situations, then we can also study the possible untested feasibility, and that becomes our goal, right? So we are now in the process of thinking about how to develop curriculum for a certain given place. And the first part of it is to study the thematic universe. And the next step would be what he calls a thematic investigation, right? Which has 4 stages. And this is the heart of the book in terms of praxis, because he's teaching us how to do our research in the process of developing a literacy program, right? So the first is collection of data. So investigators come in, they study the thematic universe, and then they involve local volunteers, and they collect data about how people live their lives in different aspects of life. The investigators inform themselves of the area, they collect data, the local people collect data, and then they have conversations with the people. All of this data is then compiled, right? Stage 2 is when they have evaluation meetings, right? In these meetings, then the investigators, along with the local volunteers, study the materials that they have gathered, right? Collate it, find out who has said what. They are further honing their knowledge of what kind of thematic universe these people exist in, what are the issues that are important to them, right? And this is where what comes to them is what people have represented through their real consciousness, through their lived experience. The idea is to transform it to a potential consciousness, a consciousness that is aware of the real world, but can also imagine a world beyond that. So the second stage in these evaluation meetings, everyone writes a report, they share the report, they discuss it, then they take it back to the people and discuss it with them. Then they also develop certain codified representations of it, pictures, graphs, and everything, right? In the third stage, they return to the area, right? And have decoding dialogues with the people. What does it mean? So you've created a picture from the knowledge gained from the people. Let's say a woman working in the house, a man walking, right? And then you have meetings with the people and show them the images and ask them to decode it. That will give you access to their view of the imagist representation of their own reality. The idea is that people are so deeply ingrained in their own lived experience that they haven't even thought of it critically. They think of it as natural. It's moving them from that to looking at their own reality as an object of study, and then making them aware of their own reality. But throughout, they are participants in that. And then in the fourth stage, you've developed codes, pictures, everything else. You've had dialogues with the people. Then you involve specialists, right? Anthropologists, sociologists, psychologists who go and interact with the people and develop their own reports, right? They give you the specialized view. But the main key is that you connect those specialized views. And then you develop a curriculum, which can have hinged themes. Now, hinged themes are the themes that may not have come out in the conversations, but which are crucial in connecting one part to the other. So after you have done that, then you have pictures, you have recorded tapes, you have graphs. You take them again to the people and ask them to respond to them, try to decipher them. And that the way they decipher them then gives you insights into how are people responding to auditory or pictorial representations of their own reality. He gives you this example that, ask a scholar to write an essay or record a tape. Send that tape to the people, ask them to listen to it, introduce them to this scholar, this intellectual, show them his picture, and then ask the people what did they get from that. Whatever the people share is then their idea of how they are receiving that expert advice. That you pass on to the intellectual, who then learns, oh man, I was thinking about it this way, but this is what the people are saying about it. What it does is it enables the intellectual to further hone their way of looking at a culture, but it also enables the people to critique the works of intellectuals, but also participate in a conversation with that. Now, driving all of this is what Freire calls the anthropological concept of culture. By that, what he means is that a concept of culture in which the humans are centered, but culture is not static. Human beings, with their collective will, can transform it. This process of education, by going into a territory, studying its thematic universe, meeting the people, collecting data, interacting with people, bringing in specialists, then going back, producing materials, discussing those materials with those who will use them, and then developing a curriculum, all is geared towards transformation, right? Transformation of the thematic universe, because only then will people be able to go beyond the limit situation. And that is when Freire says, after we've done all this, we would have articulated some sense of a pedagogy of the oppressed. And now, finally, to a summary of chapter 4, the final chapter of the book. How do we get to chapter 4? Before we get to chapter 4, Paulo Freire has already set up in chapter 1 the main project of pedagogy of the oppressed, to create a system in which everyone can attain their full humanity. He then teaches us about two modes of didactics or teaching: the banking system of education, which is top-down, and the problem-posing or problem-solving educational system, which, of course, is what he's trying to develop in the book. In chapter 2, then, he further elaborates on these two modes of teaching and what are the implications of following the banking model of education, but also what is important in developing a problem-posing, problem-solving educational method. But throughout, he's also teaching us about praxis, which is reflection and action combined become praxis, but also relationships amongst people, especially as a revolutionary leadership develops. In chapter 3, he gives us the detailed account of how to do research, how to interact with the people, how to find out the thematic universe which generates other themes within which people live, and then how, along with the people, we develop a curriculum for liberation. Chapter 4 takes us towards the revolutionary praxis of the people who have gone through the educational system that he has proposed. The idea in this chapter is to give us a sort of a loose blueprint into the revolutionary praxis itself, into bringing about a just society and change. So in the beginning part of the chapter, he discusses what are anti-dialogical ways of doing things, which is the oppressive order in which the people do not have any say. And then counter to that, what he offers is the dialogical mode of resistance. Each one of these, the anti-dialogical praxis and the dialogical praxis, he divides into 4 categories. Now remember, in the previous chapters, he has already discussed what is a dialogue, what are its basic constituent parts like hope, love, critical thinking. So by dialogical, what he means is a praxis that incorporates what he has taught us in the previous chapters. He first discusses 4 characteristics of the anti-dialogical way of doing things, and those are conquest, divide and rule, manipulation, and cultural invasion. So, the first and foremost, an oppressive system works through conquest, physical conquest of the people, but also the conquest of their consciousness and their minds. And one aspect of the conquest is that the conquered do not have a say in how they are treated, how they are viewed, how do they behave. Their views are not included in the dynamic that emerges. Connected to that is divide and rule. How do you bring about conquest? By dividing the people, by pitting them against each other through religion, right, through ethnic identities, through regional identities. So the conquerors conquer by dividing the people, by not enabling them to come together. Divide and rule was an amazing policy that was used by all the colonizers historically and is still used in contemporary politics. If you look at American politics, so many of us who work and who have to sell our labors, our interests are the same, right? But socially, we can still be divided, whereas we could be working at the same job, experiencing the same kind of exploitation, but politically we are aligned with a different group because we are looking at it in racial terms or we are looking at it in regional terms. So that is the divide and rule. But obviously I've covered these in detail in the previous conversations about the chapter when we read it. Manipulation, the same thing. It can be manipulation through the educational system. It can be manipulation of people through media, manipulation of people by literally convincing them that it's in their best interest to follow the order in which they live. But it is yet another tool that enables the anti-dialogical forces to maintain their power. And the final is cultural invasion. Now, cultural invasion can be direct, where you supplant a culture with your own and enforce your way of looking at the world on the people, or it can also be subtle, where it is done through ideological means. It might involve conquest, it might involve divide and rule, It might involve aligning people's interests to the interests of the oppressive class. All of these are ways in which one thing that runs through them is that the dominant group gets to dictate what is culture, manipulates people, divides them, and has conquered them either materially or ideologically. These four modes of operation, so to speak, is what he calls the anti-dialogical praxis, against which he teaches us four dialogical modes of resistance and transformation. So against the four anti-dialogical modes of praxis, he offers us four dialogical modes of transforming the world of revolutionary praxis. And those are cooperation, unity for liberation, organization, and cultural synthesis. Now, cooperation is offered against conquest, in a way. Then unity for liberation is offered against divide and rule. Organization against manipulation, and cultural synthesis against cultural invasion. Now he goes into detail in explaining all of these four modes of revolutionary praxis. And as I said, I've discussed them in detail, but here just a brief summary, and keep that in mind. So cooperation is cooperation amongst the people as equals, but also cooperation between the people and the so-called leadership. It will never be a situation in which the leaders get to dictate what they want people to do, or one group of people dictating to others. So cooperation, in a sense, would be built by a thorough understanding of the situation in which people are in, and in a way which is democratic, and where the leaders listen to the people and people have a say in coming together against the oppressive order. And it is offered against the dominant group's practice of conquest. Now, unity for liberation involves two kinds of unities. Unity amongst the people of their interests, that they can only do when they know the kind of world in which they live, and their unity with the leadership. And it cannot be built forcefully, and it cannot be built with the promise of change. By the time we get to this point in revolutionary praxis, we have already learned where we are, what oppresses us, what are our interests, and how best to dialogically come together towards liberation of all. Organization is the part where Freire goes into discussing the two extremes. One is a purely populist revolutionary movement in which people have no responsibility, no restraints, and he calls that licentiousness. And the other is authoritarianism, where the leaders take up the role of defining what the revolution would be. What he's encouraging us to think and practice is a mode in which leaders have a vision, but that vision is tempered by the people's opinion. And people also know that liberation means responsibility, right? So at no point can the revolutionary movement can become a free-for-all, nor can it become something that the leaders say, this is what we will do. So a combination of the two, aspirations of the people tempered by responsibility, and the vision of the leaders without authoritarianism, combined together, will then lead to liberation. And cultural synthesis then is offered in opposition to cultural invasion, right? So since it's a synthesis, what it presupposes is that whatever different strands of ways of looking at the world are available, they need to be synthesized. And when you synthesize something, you do not obliterate one part and create another one. You take the acceptable parts of differing opinions and form a synthesis. In terms of leaders and people, then it would take what the leaders aspire to do and what the people's aspirations are, and take what is practical and useful towards liberation and create a cultural synthesis. So these are 4 dialogical modes of resistance and transformation that he offers against the 4 anti-dialogical modes of doing things in chapter 4. So in conclusion, when we get to chapter 4, we have already learned that the purpose of revolutionary change is to create a space or time in which everyone can realize their full humanity, that it is a didactical process. It involves learning and teaching, that teaching cannot be the banking system of education. It has to be problem-posing system of education, and the interaction has to be dialogic, which means both sides have a say in it. It cannot be top-down or implemented by a dominant group. Then we learn in chapter 3 how best to devise a method of pedagogy which includes expert opinions but also includes the opinions of the people, and which enables people to see their own reality in teaching materials as they have informed the development of teaching materials, and they can see their own reality objectively and analyze it, right, and learn about their own lived condition. And then in chapter 4, we take all that knowledge and apply it to what is the system, the anti-dialogical way of doing things, and what possibilities exist if we develop a dialogical mode of praxis and revolutionary change. So that's roughly my summary of the chapter. I hope this is useful to you. I'm sure I've left out quite a few things. Please point those out to me. But also do keep in mind that we have over 60 conversations on the book. We have read the book from beginning to the end. So most probably the best approach for you would be, yes, do take a look at this summary, do listen to this summary, but follow the entire series and read the book with us. And I can promise you, it will be a transformative experience for you. So that's it. 4 years after I started this series, this conversation and a compilation of my summaries of the 4 chapters now concludes our reading of Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, a book that I personally consider one of the most important books, not just about education, but also about our conduct in the world and possibilities of transformation and change in the world. Thank you all so much for being with me throughout this time. Stay safe, take care, and I will now see you next time. Until then, peace and love.